I wish to thank the University of Western New Mexico and Professor María Eugenia Trillo for the opportunity to give this presentation and to participate in this symposium. The culture of freakiness. The central point of this paper is the tension and contention between a dominant culture, in this case the so-called mainstream, and its modes of representation, and those of a minority but important cultural group which, being repressed, vies for modes of overcoming the dominance. This trend also has important consequences for education. This paper is a set of prolegomena proposed for the analysis of the phenomenon, rather than a case study or a practical application to any of its particular aspects. The term friki, F-R-I-K-I in Spanish, refers to a so-called cultural group and to a person belonging to the same group. It is roughly equivalent, but not so much, to the term geek and geeky in English. Referring to such group and a person with peculiar hobbies and interests, these are mostly science fiction, fantasy, myth, computer and video games, board and role games, Japanese culture and its manifestations such as manga, anime, and other popular cultural forms, Japanese forms, for instance, origami. It started being used in Spain in the 2000s, and in 2012, it was included in the Real Academia Española dictionary. In the beginning, it was applied to people seen as extravagant and weird with an obsessive interest in strange subjects. These persons were usually specialists in one or several of these subjects. Such themes were not well accepted by mainstream culture, and those adults indulging in them were seen as immature, infantile, or at least dealing with improper material, at least for their age group. As groups aged and established themselves, experts arose who were given recognition and even sought after as advisors for publications, films, and computer applications. The subjects and interests of freakiness are seen today as related to a good developmental level of imagination, creativity, intelligence, and a general cognitive condition, not necessarily depending on the age or the school education level of the individual. The phenomenon in question may be considered as a cultural alternative or as a language game in the wider sense of a cyanotic system, and those involved in it as belonging to the game and exhibiting a positive literacy and fluency while dealing with it and with its interfaces with the dominant culture. In a parallel movement, mainstream culture started to use and even cherish these subjects, as is testified today by the abundance of science fiction and fantasy books and films, which have even substituted romantic comedies as the main items of consumption. Also, a more computer literate society rapidly produces, distributes, and consumes materials from these areas in games, animated series, and films, and all kinds of peripheral merchandising. I am proposing 3 theoretical lines as basis and guidelines for my discussions. 1, Wittgenstein's idea of a language game and its application to diverse cultural manifestations. Also, his own affirmation of the difficulty of accessing the mind of a different culture in spite of knowing the languages involved. 2, Bolívar Echeverria's concept of semiospace and semiophagy for the conceptual universe of a culture and the influence and possible dominance of one such upon a different one. 3, the concept being called multimodality, mostly in social semiotics and in functional linguistics, akin to multimedia, but also embracing the mostly semiotic and culturally different modes of registers or representation of languages and the cognitive platforms in which they operate. 1. Wittgenstein proposes his concept of language game, Philosophical Investigations 7, as a set of simple rules made mostly of names and orders alike to the games by means of which children learn their language. We evade this concept of primitive language and rather make emphasis on the nominal, prescriptive character of such a system, naming and ordering. Wittgenstein, I shall also call the whole consisting of language and the actions in which it is woven a language game. Searle's illocutionary force and quality could also be used in conjunction with this concept, but I will omit it for the time being. 1.1. Wittgenstein, Philosophical Investigations 206, proposes an explorer in an unknown country with a language quite strange to him. In what sense could it be said that the people there gave orders, understood them, rebelled against them, and so on? The common behavior of mankind is the system of reference by means of which we interpret an unknown game and language. But now we know that the behavior of men and women is anything but common, except in its most gross and general sense. Cultures are different in most of the world, not only linguistic, but also cognitively, as well as different systems of representation. Wittgenstein proceeds imagining that the people in that country carry on the usual human activities in an articulate language, as all human languages are. Their behavior seems intelligible and logical, but perhaps trying to learn their language may prove impossible, for there is no apparent 207 connection between the sounds they make and their actions. But without the sounds, their actions will fall into confusion. This is to illustrate the difficulty in the appraisal of different modes of representation, a hindrance that goes beyond the language barrier and opens gaps between cultures and cultural modes. And ultimately, 208, teaching which is not meant to apply to anything but examples given is different from that which points beyond them. In different language games, not only the terms being used differ, but the systems of reference vary widely and make for different cultural uses. Is freaky culture a different language game, I ask? I advance that it is not only so, but also one that enriches the repertoire of the language of the dominant culture into fringe areas. More should be done in analyzing the particular features of the freaky language game. Moreover, since under its umbrella definition there exist many subgroups and subcodes, such as the science fiction fan community, or otakus, or different areas. 2. Bolívar Echeverría made use of the term ethos for a mixture of procedures of use, costume, convention, worldview, and automated behavior. It is at the same time dwelling or refuge as much as tool as weapon. It is at the same time in the subjects as in the objects. And the social structural behavior configures a so-called ethos, what he called a historical ethos, which is a principle of construction of the life world, the Lebenswelt. Through history, different ethos can be identified: the realist, the classic, the romantic. That which particularly interests Echeverría for its feature is the one he calls the Baroque ethos. That which he feels the name can be applied to the modern period, since, as Baroque art does, it accepts the inseparable of the formal principles of the past, and at the same time employs it over a new substance so as to express its novelty and novel potential. It places on the instead of ossified gestures and exhausted vital forces, new and more personal ones, which reconstruct the old forms into new shapes, new manners, and new meanings. I feel that this principle can be applied to the milieu of freaky culture, and our argument will proceed from this intuition. For Echeverría, the Baroque ethos surges from a matched pairing of interdependence between two antagonical proposals of form for the same objects. One, conservative and defensive, and the other, progressive and offensive. The latter cannot eliminate and substitute the former, and thus must seek its help in its manner of handling the objects in question, which overflow the possibilities of both. For an example, Echeverría proposes the culture of Spanish America in the 17th and 18th centuries, with its reconstitution of the almost destroyed Indian and African cultures through the forms of the Iberian and Catholic culture. The end result, the mestizaje, is more than mere syncretism. It is a renewal of both participants for the reconstruction of a new entity in a new, mostly mental territory. Echeverría proposes that in a confrontation of cultural codes and differing ethos, often one envelops and swallows the other, codigophagia. However, it also happens that there develops a tension between them where both coexist, affecting each other and balancing. According to him, 1994, mestizaje, the natural way of life between cultures, does not take well to a chemical or biological metaphor. Therefore, it is rather a semiotic process that can be called codicophagia. The subcodifications or singular and concrete configurations of the codes of what is human do not seem to have other form of coexisting between themselves than that of devouring each other, destructively striking the center of constitutive symbolization of the one they have facing them, and appropriate and integrate in themselves the still living residues still left, submitting themselves at the same time to an essential alteration. For Echeverría, the shock between the European and the American pre-Hispanic cultures is exemplary, since one can hardly imagine more divergent cultures, languages, cognitive spaces, and even worldviews than those maintained by both sides, two different civilizational choices. Freaky culture is possibly in a similar position of divergence regarding the mainstream one, especially that version still upheld by adults as the dominant and correct one. I propose that the multimodal procedures of freaky culture, due to the richness of its language game, imagistic, visual, typographical, linguistical, computational, ludic, multicultural, qualify the individuals involved in this milieu, the freaky, and enable them not only to handle the subcodes of his or her interests, but also gives them a capacity to better operate when they facilitate and widen the confines of mainstream culture. Reciprocally, the mainstream culture is slowly appropriating the forms of freaky culture, such as the interest in science fiction and its acceptance of Asian forms of entertainment. Moreover, the forms of freaky culture are increasingly being accepted as valid interests for adults and even as valid subjects of academic research. This is a phenomenon similar to bilingualism or multilingualism, where the procedures of the second or nth language do not interfere with those of the first one, but rather supplement and reinforce them and facilitate its usage. In another example given to me as a parallel by Manuel Salinas, the slaves that were brought to Spanish and English America, and from whom everything was taken, kept only their music and their rhythmical patterns, and with this, in the instrument and resources they found in this new world, renewed and evolved their forms into such ones as danzón, sones, blues, and jazz. Then the subjugated forms came ahead to take over and even dominate the previously dominant ones, but in a fertile crossbreeding and mutual influence of hybridization. 3. What Gunter Kress offers in his Perspective of Multimodality, 2003, is a particular take on design from the perspective of social semiotics, which deal with all the means we have for making meanings, the modes of representation, and considers their specific ways of configuring the world. For Kress, there are many kinds of meaning at issue in design and reception, but the social aspects of semiotics points to the fact that meanings always relate to specific societies and their cultures and to the meanings of the members of those cultures. Sign, as a fusion of form and meaning, signifiant and signifié, are embedded in our cultures, and we select forms in such a way that they express the meanings that we have always aptly applied. These forms and these meanings become transparent for a culture and unquestionable. Only when there is a case of a class of culture, the relations become under scrutiny and possible conflict. For Kress, in alphabetic cultures, writing tends to start in words, grammar, and syntax as the transcription of a speech. It quickly develops its own structures and form, so that the written form is very different from the spoken one. Yet, writing does lean on a speech. Speech happens in time. The logic of temporal sequence is a major principle of ordering of languages such as English or Spanish, but modes and media exist in culturally and historically shaped constellations. The one that has dominated the alphabetic cultures of the West over the last 300 years or so is that mode of writing with the medium of book and page. But contemporary texts, information book of all kinds, web pages, screens, CD-ROMs, and things as this conference, for instance, and so on, in their increasingly often image-like textual organization, ask the reader to perform a different semiotic work, namely, to design the order of the text for themselves. The phenomena of entry point and reading or scanning path are turning increasingly multimodal, with the screen as the site of the image accompanied by sound and text, and the image and the logic of the image shaping the order and arrangements on the screen. From the point of view of the rhetoric of communication, Crace points out that the contemporary social world is marked by increasing fragmentation and individuation, Beck, in contrast to the world of stable structures of the 19th and 20th centuries. In periods of stability, effective communication is ruled by the idea of convention and of competent actions in relation to those conventions. In periods of fragmentation and individuation, communication is fraught. Each environment asks that social and political relations, tastes, needs, and desires be newly assessed. Therefore, once again, we advance that freaky culture enables its participants in just these sets of skills and fluency, where they are at home not only with their own sets of codes, but can also transfer them to the wider cultural aspects, making the rhetoric and communicative progress more able and encompassing in relation to a variety of possible audiences and interlocutors. I will finish with only a couple of caveats that Kathy Mills mentions in her paper, Shrek Meets Vygotsky, regarding the extent of the multimodal practices of adolescence. She repeats the idea that technologies for communication inside and outside the school have ended the need to participate, have ended the era of dominance of pen and paper. For her, the reading world is still vital, but not unique nor all that is needed to participate in many spheres of life. Some of the practices adolescents involve themselves with include those mentioned above, but also video, movie creation, digital composing and rendering, online fan fiction, illustrated stories, lyrics, and music interfacing, among others. Adolescents need facility with an array of multimodal and digital literacies for different social purposes, critical inquiry, creativity, and communication. And I may add, in many cases, adults, and mostly the teachers, also need to develop these skills and literacies if they want to be effective in their role and purpose. However, it must be noted that, A, not all adolescents nor adults are digital natives. B, adolescents' engagement in multimodal textual practices is not about fitting language to the interests of youth. Rather, textual practices that give recognition in the world outside school can be created and stimulated. C, although the current focus is on the multimodal practices of youth in their recreational spaces, this needs to be balanced with a scaffolded multimodal practice in school settings. In the end, freaky culture is a matter of multimodal literacy, but it is not self-sufficient, nor all its users are fluent enough in its modes so as to be able to transpose them to the requirements of mainstream culture, mainly the linguistic and textual practices taught at school and in social intercourse. In this day and age, multimodality is becoming everyday currency in the practices of social semiotics, and therefore a necessity. There is the need of a critical look at varieties such as the freaky culture as to reconsider their value and their uses. Mills concludes, and I concur in this conclusion, that schools have a greater responsibility to introduce the new literacies that have been recognized. Creating a space for students to make connection with popular and multimodal text in the classroom is necessary, but not sufficient to prepare adolescents for social and civic participation. Students need guidance by experts that move them beyond the known to the new and into real life. Thank you very much.